If cognition of morality, that is, simply knowing right from wrong, were enough to make us moral, there would be far less immoral behaviors in the world. Behavior also involves emotions and actions. When you think, feel, and act in a moral way, you experience certain emotional rewards. That is, feelings of personal satisfaction and pride. When you commit an immoral act, on the other hand, you feel guilty. So, morality involves cognition or reason, emotion, and behavior. Are children capable of making moral choices? Now, according to new psychological research, babies as young as 6 months old are equipped with rudimentary moral abilities previously thought to arrive much later in childhood. This video begins with these latest findings and work backward to retrace how psychologists have come to understand the moral development of a child. In this video, we will talk about the evidences of kindness in newborn babies, the stages of moral development, the role of emotions in all these processes, how to tame down aggression, and the eroding empathy in college students. So, from the Infant Cognition Center at Yale University comes this headline: Some sense of good and evil seems to be bred in the bone. In their experiments, researchers Paul Bloom, Karen Wine, and Kylie Hamlin observed what they call as glimmers of moral thoughts, feelings, and judgments in babies who were younger than a year old. In one baby morality experiment carried out at a Yale laboratory, geometric objects with faces were manipulated like puppets to behave in a way that either help or hinder another puppet as it attempted to climb a hill. For example, a yellow circle helped a red square while a green triangle blocked its way. After viewing the scene, 6 to 10-year-old old babies were presented a choice of either the helper, which is the yellow circle, or the hinderer, that is the green triangle object on the tray. Overwhelmingly, they chose the good guy, that is the yellow circle object, demonstrating their primitive yet clear presence for good over or preference for good over bad behavior. To take in the importance of this new perspective on baby morality, you need only to consider the opposite view that had previously dominated psychology. It began with Jean-Jacques Rousseau in 1762, who called the newborn human child a perfect idiot. It rose to prominence with William James in his 1890 description of a baby's mental life as one great blooming, buzzing confusion. As it turns out, these were just guesses. In fact, the difficulty of assessing the mind of preverbal babies proved unsurmountable until researchers came up with experimental methods of measuring a baby's looking time. In these experiments, researchers used the length of time a baby looked at something or someone as a measure of his interest in it. With this technique, researchers learned that babies prefer to engage with objects that move, whether mobiles or faces, from watching babies' eye movements and behaviors. Researchers have also determined that they can detect and mimic other people's moods and expressions starting a few days after birth. If a baby sees a playmate or caregiver crying, he frowns. If another child is joyful, he responds in kind. This sort of mimicking is called an empathic response. When Charles Darwin noticed that certain animal species acted empathically, so did his six-month-old son, he concluded that empathy must be innate. Demonstrations of empathy in toddlers are the basis for the belief that altruism came about as human adaptation to assure the survival of the species. Altruism is a selfless concern for the welfare of others that is expressed through acts of kindness, sharing, cooperation, and helping. So, if empathy and altruism are in part evolutionary in origin, it makes sense that they are present to some degree at birth. Yale researchers' findings show that a baby comes into the world with a moral foundation that includes the capacity and willingness to judge the action of others, some sense of justice, gut responses to altruism and nastiness. Um, Now, how a child's moral develop or reasoning develops from this foundation then depends on his cognitive growth, his family, and cultural environment. Here's a story. Inside the classroom, the most unpopular, overweight, and wearing glasses boy in the sixth grade is being teased mercilessly by a bully who keeps knocking his books onto the floor and calling him names like Taba and Labo. Two other boys are watching this scene from a nearby row. Both feel sorry for the boy and wish the bully would stop. But what does each actually do about it? Boy number one laughs nervously, in effect endorsing and egging on the bully's immoral behavior. Boy number two leaves his seat, retrieves the boy's books from the floor, and hand them back to him. On his way back to his seat, he knocks the bully's books onto the floor, saying, "See how it feels like? Leave him alone." So, what is the cognition and emotional process that leads boy number one to take the cowardly way out and boy number two to play the hero in the situation? Let's look at some past psychological theories on the development of morality for some insights. So, Jean Piaget found that children's ideas regarding rules, moral judgments, and punishments tended to change as they get older. In other words, just as they were or there were stages to children's cognitive development, so there were also universal stages to their moral development. In his view, preschoolers have no real sense of morality, while children between the ages of 5 and 10 are moral realists who believe the rules are absolute. In this age group, a fight can break out among a pair of card players if one should sneak a peek at the other's hand. They also tend to administer quick punishments for perceived misdeeds, something Piaget called as immanent justice. He pointed to the tendency of a typical child of this age to employ magical thinking to tie unrelated consequences to an act that he considers to be against the rules. In the child's mind, if someone cheats at cards and then falls down and scrapes his knee, justice will have been served. Based on his observations of different aged children at play and in conflict, Piaget came up with one of the first theories of how morality develops incrementally in concert with cognitive development. At about 8, Piaget said children move into a stage of moral relativism. With their maturing ability to connect rules with reason, at this age, children understand that rules can change to fit different circumstances. Piaget's theory of children's moral development can be seen as an application of his ideas on cognitive development generally. As such, his theory here has both the strengths and weaknesses of his overall theory. Piaget uses qualitative methods, that is observation and clinical interviews. His research is based on very small sample. His methods are not standardized and therefore are not replicable. It is impossible to say from his research how generalizable the results are. His is His is exploratory research, which is useful for generating new ideas rather than for the rigorous testing of hypotheses. Moreover, Piaget argues that the shift from moral realism to moral relativism occurs around the age of 8 to 10, and that children younger than this do not take motives into account when judging how someone is to blame. Other research suggests that children develop an understanding of the significance of subjective facts facts at a much earlier age. Nelson in 1980 found that even three-year-old kids could distinguish intention from consequences if the story was made simple enough. Piaget's research is about children's moral reasoning. Many psychologists argue that what is far more important is not what children think about moral issues, but how they actually behave in such issues. And we should not forget that there is no one-to-one relationship between attitudes and behaviors. So we have to talk about Lawrence Goldberg. So, morality is rarely as black and white as cheating at cards. Culture influences an individual's view of right and wrong. Some moral dilemmas are complex and subjective. When the stakes are very high and personal, it can be difficult to assign greater morality to one course over another action. That was the challenge taken on in the late 1960s and 1970s by psychology researcher Lawrence Goldberg, who gives off a John Mayerish vibe in this picture and who refined Piaget's theory. Goldberg focused on the gray areas between wrong and right to see how both children and adults handled them. In one famous experiment, Goldberg posed this situation. A man's wife is dying. The life-saving medicine that would treat her illness costs about $2,000, 10 times what it actually costs to make. After asking everyone he knew for help, the man had amassed only $1,000 to pay for the medicine. So he asked the pharmacist to sell the medicine to him cheaper and allow him to pay the rest later. The pharmacist refused. The man then broke into the pharmacy and got the medicine by force to save his wife. After hearing this story, Goldberg asked children, adolescents, and adults who in the story displayed moral or immoral behavior. The man who robbed and or the druggist who denied a dying person a needed medicine. In fact, there was no right or wrong answer to Goldberg's moral dilemma experiment. He was more interested in the process of moral reasoning participants used to arrive at their own answers than who they chose as moral or immoral. After studying all the participants' responses and comparing them, he came up with 3 levels of moral reasoning. Like Piaget, Goldberg tied morality to cognitive development, most critically to the ability to see a situation from someone else's perspective. Goldberg's 3 stages of moral reasoning include number 1, pre-conventional morality, that is highlighted by punishment and rewards. On this me first, second, and third level, morality begins with strict obedience to authority and evolves to an exchange. Nice behavior for rewards, and a child first follows rules because he sees adults as having absolute power, and then because it serves his own interest. Now, the second stage is the stage of conventional morality, that is highlighted by social norms. As a child progresses to this middle level of moral reasoning, he first wants to live up to other people's expectations. Then, he follows rules to maintain social order, a contract with which he agrees and wishes to uphold. And then comes the post-conventional or principled morality stage, wherein what is important are moral codes. At the highest level of moral reasoning, the individual first adheres to a social contract only when he considers it valid. Then, usually in the 20s, his personal morality is based more on abstract principles of justice that fits his personal worldview. It may not always conform to the dominant convention of his society. A person's progression through levels 1 to 3 always moves in the same lower to higher direction. As Goldberg said, even though most people will never reach the final stage of level 3, most children operates at a pre-conventional level of morality, but so do many adolescents and even some adults. Now, like Piaget, Goldberg stressed cognitive development that enabled children to take the point of view of others, in effect, to role play. Along with this cognitive ability, Goldberg also pointed to the child's social experiences as a factor. If a grade school child had no awareness of poverty, for example, he may not be able to fully appreciate the moral dilemma in the experiment. According to Goldberg, at each stage in this progression, the basis for moral decision making changes. A child starts in level 1 paying heed to external forces such as a social approval or punishment. By level 2, the child's basis of decision making has shifted to what everyone else thinks. Finally, if she reaches level 3, the adolescent or young adult is making moral decisions based on her own concepts of justice and rights. Goldberg has been criticized for his assertion that women seem to be deficient in their moral reasoning abilities when compared to men. Carol Gilligan in 1982, a research assistant of Goldberg, criticized her former mentor's theory because it was based on so narrowly on research using white upper-class men and boys. She argued that women are not deficient in the moral reasoning or in their moral reasoning, and instead proposed that men and women, and males and females rather, reason differently. Girls and women focus more on staying connected and maintaining interpersonal relationships. Goldberg's theory has also been criticized for emphasizing justice to the exclusion of other values, with the result that it may not adequately address the arguments of those who value other moral aspects of actions. Similarly, critics argue that Goldberg's stages are culturally biased, that the highest stages in particular reflect a westernized ideals of justice based on individualistic thought. This is biased against those that live in non-Western societies that place less emphasis on individualism, like the Philippines. Another criticism of Goldberg's theory is that people frequently demonstrate significant inconsistencies in their moral judgments. This often occurs in moral dilemmas involving drinking and driving or business situations where participants have been shown to reason at a lower developmental stage, typically using more self-interest driven reasoning, that is stage 2, than authority and social order obedience driven reasoning, that is stage 4. Critics argue that Goldberg's theory cannot account for such inconsistencies. So, the next theory that we have to talk about is that of Nancy Eisenberg. What if helping someone would cost you to sacrifice something? Working in the 1980s and the 1990s, psychological researcher Nancy Eisenberg designed morality experiments which would be more realistic and suited to a child's perspective of the world. Eisenberg and her associates brought children of different ages from preschool through high school into a laboratory where they were asked to imagine themselves in this situation. A child in a child is on his way to a birthday party when he encounters another child who has fallen and hurt herself. Would he stop to help out the child who fell at the risk of missing out on fun and goodies awaiting him at the party, or would he go on his way without stopping? Like Goldberg, Eisenberg was more interested in finding out the motivation behind each child's choice. She found that for the most part, only the upper class elementary school age children and adolescents helped the injured girl out of a feeling of empathy. Those that displayed a pro-social level of moral reasoning when they considered the injured girl's perspective and how their helping actions would make her feel in spite of the inconvenience it caused them. Pro-social moral reasoning is the type of thinking people do when they're deciding whether to help, share with, or comfort others when these actions could prove costly to themselves. Eisenberg found that although other children and adolescents said they would help the girl, they did so primarily for personal gain, not out of pro-social moral reasoning. Such gains might include social approval from authority figures or favor from the girl in exchange for their help. As such, these helpers were more guided by self-interest than empathy. Age was a critical factor in how participants responded to these hypothetical dilemma. But Eisenberg concluded that age was not the only thing that determines who operates out of a genuine empathy for someone in need. She pointed out environmental factors, especially cultural values, and the quality of parenting or parental models as also having a role in predicting which children would be led by empathy to employ pro-social reasoning. Eisenberg and later researchers studying child morality found that parents who have a warm emotional tone, parents who communicate expectations of mature behavior, and parents who provide explanations for rules raise children who exhibit the highest level of pro-social reasoning and behaviors. Thus, a child with a high moral compass at a young age holds on to it as she ages. Well, to find out, Eisenberg and her research associates completed a 17-year longitudinal study of some of the 4 and 5-year-old who had participated in the birthday party moral reasoning test. The purpose of this follow-up study was to see if those children who showed pro-social attitudes at 4 and 5 were still showing them at age 17. Now, the results were affirmative. The pro-social younger children became altruistic teenagers. They were more helpful towards others and could reason in complex ways about moral dilemmas. Their more self-interested peers at 4 and 5 grew into teenagers who were less morally mature. For example, if faced with someone needing help, these adolescents said they would help someone they personally liked, but they would bypass another person whom they did not know or like. In contrast, the morally matured teenagers said they would help someone regardless of their personal feelings about the person. Although many researchers studying moral development in children focus on the mind or reason as the primary driver of behaviors, Other place greater emphasis on how moral affect plays a part. Moral affect refers to feelings that include both negative emotions such as guilt and more positive emotions such as emotional attachment to parents and empathy. The first psychological researcher to weigh in on this issue was none other than Sigmund Freud, father of psychoanalysis and one of psychology's biggest crackhead. Boy, this man loves cocaine. In his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, he famously said that he had thought about cocaine in a kind of daydream. But that's a topic for a different day, kids. Freud's theory posited that children act in moral ways to avoid the guilty feeling that their superego imposes when they behave badly. Freud saw the Oedipal and or Electra complex wherein a child aged between 3 to 6 becoming unconsciously sexually attached to their opposite sex parent and hostile toward their same sex parent who they view as their rivals as the period where this conflict plays out most on children. Don't do drugs, kids. This was the time when he believed children internalize the moral standards of their same-sex parent as they resolve their Oedipus and Electra conflicts. From the thinking of Watsonian behaviorists came the view that the best discipline for misbehaving children was to forcefully squash their negative impulses. When children misbehaved, the advice for parents was to threaten the withdrawal of their love and affection. More recent research has shown that this form of parenting, using physical controls, threats, and withdrawals of affection, is counterproductive. It actually produces lower levels of moral behaviors in children. In contrast, parental behaviors that teaches children the positive effect of their pro-social actions on others foster more positive behaviors and moral character. This style of parent-child interaction, called inductive parenting, demonstrates to children acceptable and adaptive ways to behave. It encourages them to take the perspective of others. Inductive parenting also emphasizes parents talking with children about their expectations of them. The parenting implication of Freud's theory have been augmented and modified by later researchers. But Freud is credited with being the first to point out that emotions such as pride, shame, and guilt are important in the development of moral or ethical behaviors and to raise questions about the origins of empathy. Speaking of empathy, as demonstrated by the Yale experiments, babies come into this world wired to care about others. A large body of research also showed that parental models and cultural norms play a decisive role in shaping this human instinct into higher levels of moral and pro-social reasoning. A child's concern for others' feelings and needs appear to develop in 4 stages. The core feelings is sympathy or empathy, but this emotions changes and deepens to reflect a child's more advanced cognitive understanding. The first stage is from birth to the first year, wherein a baby cannot separate herself from her adult caregivers, so whatever mom or dad feels, she feels too. This is called global empathy. The second stage happens at around 1 to 3 years old. So at this stage, a child will try to comfort others by offering or doing something that she feels might make them feel better because it works for her. She might share a toy or stroke the other person. This is actually called egocentric empathy. In preschool and elementary school, a child understands more about the differences between herself and others. When she wants to comfort another, she helps by offering something that the other person might like. Lastly, in late childhood and adolescence, a young person has a deeper understanding of the sometimes complex reasonings for the sadness or troubles of another person. She begins to feel empathy for groups of people who may be at a disadvantage. Parents and other adults can teach altruistic behaviors to children by using positive verbal reinforcement. On the other hand, bribing children to get them to be nicer and more caring towards others doesn't work as the research shows. Why not? Apparently, children who receive tangible rewards for altruistic behaviors become tied to those rewards. When the goodies stop, so does altruism. Out of the window go their positive helping behaviors. Now, the foundation for children to learn pro-social action is a warm and caring relationship with an adult who models caring and helpful behaviors towards them. When a parent models the desired behavior, children internalize the actions desired of them. Um, contrarily, children are less likely to internalize the actions of adults with whom they have a cold and mistrustful relationship. Studies have been done of unusual charitable adults. For example, those Christians who risked their lives to help Jews escape the Nazi during World War II. Such studies have shown that these altruistic individuals had been raised by moralistic adults who practice what they preached. Based on research done early in the 20th century, some behavioral psychologists hang on to the belief that morality depends on the situation a child or teenager finds himself in. They call this the doctrine of specificity. Specificity. Those holding this view says moral reasoning, moral affect, and moral behavior do not spring from an internalized set of moral principles. Instead, morality is specific to the situation and is not fixed and is not a fixed character trait. More recent research presents evidence that those young people who are capable of higher levels of moral reasoning appears to have greater consistencies between their thoughts and actions. In a controlled experiment, only 15% of college students who reasoned at the post-conventional principled at the post-conventional principled level cheated on a test when given the opportunity. This compared with 55% of the conventional students and 70% of those operating at the pre-conventional level of moral reasoning. With this framework in mind, let us return to the classroom incident that began in this section of the video. Which level of moral development do you think boy number 2 had reached when he intervened to stop a bully's harmful action? What about boy number 1 who laughed at the bully's action? A case can be made that boy number 2 at level 2 or rather operates at level 2 in Goldberg's schema of moral reasoning. He understood the bully's behaviors not to be in line with the social contract governing behavior on the inside the classroom, but he also may have been operating at the level 3 when he concluded that justice needed to be carried out in the form of an intervention. In Eisenberg's framework, boy number 2 felt genuine empathy for the boy that was bullied and was motivated to risk his own safety by getting out of his seat to help the child. So his actions were empathic or rather empathetic and pro-social. Meanwhile, boy number one can be seen as operating from Goldberg's lowest level, the pre-conventional stage of moral reasoning. This is when rules apply only when it suits the one's personal interest. In Eisenberg's framework, boy number one felt the bullied boy's need for help, but made a safer choice by staying put. His moral reasoning and actions were not empathetic or pro-social. All this talk about what is right and wrong begs the question: does a lack of action make someone less moral than the person who takes a personal risk to stop a wrong? The answer to this question uh, to this question for most people is an easy yes. But what about a large group of people faced with evidence of immoral actions, even atrocities being perpetrated by a representative government? This is one of the great unresolved philosophical questions of the 20th century. For example, what is the when it is applied to the citizenry of Germany during World War II, who did little to defy Hitler and stop the extermination of German Jews? Or for a more recent example, when PNP personnel chose to be silent during the height of extrajudicial killings in the country, especially when a lot of the perpetrators were found to be members of the police force. But the question of moral responsibility also arises in small communities. It has been applied in more recent years to particularly heinous acts of violence perpetrated by groups of adolescents on weaker victims. By assessing the quality of empathy involved in taking pro-social actions, Eisenberg extended the usefulness of Goldberg's level of moral development. Taken together, the research provides a framework for understanding moral choices made by children inside the classroom or school buses, as well as by adults in their workplace and as citizens. The cultural aspect of pro-social reasoning have also been extensively studied. When a culture traditionally emphasizes group concerns over those of individuals, pro-social reasoning is more valued and thus more widely practiced. At the other end of a child's moral spectrum are self-serving attitudes and behaviors that are aggressive and harmful to others. Sometimes the word assertive and aggressive are incorrectly believed to have the same meaning. But in psychological terms, they're not interchangeable. Assertive behaviors are goal-oriented actions that help someone obtain legitimate ends. Aggressive behavior, on the other hand, whether verbal or physical, are carried out without heeding the needs of others. They are intended to cause harm, damage, or injury to another person. In children and teenagers, aggressive actions encompass hitting, name calling, spreading malicious gossip, pushing, shoving, bullying, initiating fights, and even stealing. Studies have found that highly aggressive children have a strong likelihood to become antisocial, criminal young adults. Because of this outcome, much attention has been devoted to what causes aggression in children. At one time, psychologists attributed children's aggression to their high levels of frustration. Although feeling blocked from having or doing what one wants can lead to aggressive behavior, further research has shown frustration to be below two other causes or three other causes in this context. The first is early family experiences. The use of harsh physical punishment by parents is positively correlated with aggressive behaviors in children. In one 1990 study, physically punished children were rated twice as aggressive by their peers and teachers compared to other children. At the same time, not all spanked children are overly aggressive. University of Tulane researchers studied the effect of spanking using a mixed population of 2,500 children between the ages of 3 and 5. The group included 45% who, according to their mothers, had not been spanked, 28% who were spanked once or twice, and 26% who were spanked more than twice. The odds of a child being more aggressive at age 3 rose by 50% if he had been spanked twice in the month before being observed by researchers. This 2010 study stood out from others done previously in that investigators accounted for variables that included the mother's acts of neglect, parents' use of alcohol or drugs, and violence or aggression between parents. And some aggressive children did not receive physical punishment. Parents who simply model aggressive behaviors in front of their children can also produce more aggressive children. These parents tend to use more forceful rather than cooperative means of settling conflicts. Yeah, they yell rather than speak calmly or discuss an issue. They grab the TV remote out of someone's hand rather than asking or negotiating a peaceful solution to competing needs or desires. The second factor is that of violent television. A typical children's cartoon shows on average one violent act every 3 minutes. What's the impact of all this mayhem on growing children? There are many correlations and some experimental studies linking children's viewing of violent TV programs with spikes in aggressive behaviors. In the laboratory of social learning theorist Albert Bandura, children were given specially created TV programs to watch. In these shows, an adult acted violently, kicking and hitting a plastic doll named Bobo Doll. Two groups of children were given the same doll to play with. One group watched the violent program and the other did not. Those who watched were more likely to imitate the on-screen character and act violently towards Bobo than the others. A longitudinal study looked at how children's violent TV watching at age 8 affected their criminal record at age 30. Those boys who watched most violent TV committed the most and more serious crimes as young men. The same correlation was true for girls, however, with lower rates of violence for girls in trouble with the law. And the third is problems with processing emotions. In the 1990s, researchers started to investigate whether any cognitive deficits might contribute to a child's level of aggressive behavior. This work revealed that aggressive boys often respond aggressively because they are not as skilled as their peers in sensing another person's intention. They fail to accurately interpret other people's intentions. When they're unsure of why someone does something or look at them at a certain way, they tend to respond aggressively. Another study investigated whether anything could be done to help young people like this overcome their deficiencies and be less aggressive as a result. In one correctional facility, incarcerated adolescents were taught how to pay attention to non-hostile cues in a social setting. When they accurately perceived hostility coming their way, they were shown how to use alternative responses. Supervisors at the juvenile correction facility who were questioned after this training program reported less aggression and less impulsivity in those adolescents who had taken the training. In summary, parents increase a child's aggression when they use physically forceful punishments. If there are a lot of unresolved conflicts in the home, parents model aggressive behaviors which are then internalized by their children. Aggressive adolescents are more inclined to choose aggressive friends, thus reinforcing the behavior in peer groups. Beyond a child's immediate home and school environment, studies show that poverty and high levels of neighborhood crime creates a culture of violence with many negative impacts on children. A recent meta-study of 14,000 students done by University of Michigan researchers looked at whether college students' empathy, meaning their concern for for the needs of others, had changed compared to earlier generations. The study results show that students who entered college after the year 2000 were 40% less empathetic than college students of earlier decades. Researchers also noticed that while it would have been easy for the students who took the survey to make themselves look and sound kinder and nicer if they wished to, they did not bother to try. Another finding was that the students themselves felt that their peers at school are less compassionate. So, when conjecturing on the causes behind these disturbing results, the University of Michigan researchers focused on four likely factors causing the decrease in empathy on campus. The first is the decrease of free play. The amount of time children spend playing outdoor and in unstructured activities with other children declined by a third between 1981 and 2003. As a result, they don't learn to connect emotionally with other children or interact informally in positive ways. The second is that the resulting increase in the time kids spend indoors, alone, and in front of screen. That is TV, video games, and computer, where they are likely to increase their level of aggression and decrease their positive social skills. Number three is the misuse of self-esteem by today's parents and even teachers who reward and praise their children when not merited, increasing a child's narcissistic tendencies. Lastly, the study authors cited dominant individualism and a glorification of competition in the culture at large at the cost of cooperation and altruism. Studies such as this one and others cited throughout this video demonstrate some of the new directions being taken in today's psychological research on the origins and impediments to morality. Much of it is geared towards lending insights into current social issues by examining the possible roots of those problems in childhood. Child rearing practices, how they were, or rather how and where children play, and how young people who break the rules are punished or rehabilitated also all play key roles in shaping the long-term picture of child morality. So in this video, we learned that babies before 1 year of age demonstrate a rudimentary sense of fairness and morality. Also, we learned that moral thoughts don't always produce moral behaviors. and that aggressive behaviors in children has been correlated with harsh discipline methods, watching more violent television shows, and an inability to read people's emotions. That's all for today. My name is Dex Kamitan, and thank you for watching.